Well, welcome to our Bible study. Last time we were together, we looked at the events that occurred on Palm Sunday. And this is the start of what we would call Holy Week or Passion Week. And it really comprises 8 full days. And Palm Sunday, of course, is when Jesus did his triumphal entry. But we recognize from our study that Jesus had been proclaiming that he was Messiah, that the kingdom of heaven was at hand for 3 years of his ministry. So, yes, he was entering Jerusalem this special day, and this is the only time that he really allowed people to call him Messiah, because all the other times when people wanted to do it, he said, don't tell anybody, because it wasn't the right time. But this day, as we saw, fulfilled prophecy specifically in Daniel and specific to the day, the week, the month, the year when he would enter Jerusalem and show himself as Messiah. And this was prophesied in Daniel, and we looked at the calculations there. We also learned that not only did he fulfill prophecy, but the 10th of Nisan, which Palm Sunday was the day that the Passover lamb was selected. That's the day that the high priest went over into Bethlehem to select the lamb and bring him over. And that same day, Jesus presented himself as the Passover lamb for all of us. And he presented himself in the temple where they would observe and actually monitor him, question him for 4 days to make sure that he was without spot or blemish. Now, that was Palm Sunday. The next day, he went in, and we'll read of Jesus actually cleansing the temple and angering quite a few people in doing that, but also impressing other people who wanted to hear him. And here is the kind of a timeline. And again, you'll note that on Palm Sunday, that event was recorded in all 4 Gospels. So it's significant when you see things recorded in 4 Gospels, something to pay attention to. For example, the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the events recorded in the 4 Gospels. So it is important. There's lessons for us. And again, this event really kicks off Holy Week, as we know it, and very important. So the next day, actually Palm Sunday, he went in the temple, walked around, checked things out, and then he went back to Bethany to stay with Lazarus and his sisters. So Monday morning, he comes and he enters the temple again. Notice it's recorded in 3 Gospels. And how many times did Jesus cleanse the temple? Well, if we go back in our study, we saw that at the start of Jesus' ministry, after the wedding in Cana, where he turned the water into wine, Jesus had 5 disciples then, and he attended his first Passover. Remember, Jesus attended all 4. Well, actually, this was the 4th Passover Jesus was going to attend. So the first one, start of his ministry, he went in the temple, and John records that he actually cleansed the temple there also. He overturned the tables and chased people out. So that's recorded at the start of his ministry. And now the 4th Passover that Jesus attends in his public ministry, he's doing the same thing. And the Gospel of John also captures that Jesus again predicted his death again on that Monday. But we'll move on, and here's kind of an interesting picture. This is a picture of not Jerusalem proper, but at this time it would have been called Jebus, owned by the Jebusites. But before that, we'll even go back into history even more, into Genesis 14. Melchizedek lived there, and he was king, and the town then was called Salem. We pronounce it Salem, but that's where King Melchizedek reigned, was in that town of Salem. And we'll read in Genesis 14 that, if you remember, Abraham, his son Lot, went to live in Sodom and Gomorrah, and 5 enemy kings of Lot, went in and raided the town and took captive Lot, all his family, his possessions, along with the rest of them, and went. As soon as Abraham heard of that, he collected his own army, and he went after those 5 kings and defeated them. On his way back to Lot to bring on his way back to Sodom and Gomorrah with Lot and the people, he was met by two kings. One was the king of Lot, who wanted to give him all the spoils because he won the battle. And the other was King Melchizedek, who was not only king, he was high priest. And he offered him bread and wine. And Abraham accepted what Salem, the king of Salem, had offered him, and that was the bread and wine. But again, he was a priest of the God Most High. We read that in Genesis 14, verses 18 to 20. And Melchizedek blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And he gave him a tithe of all. Kind of fascinating. Notice the bread and wine. What connection does that have to Holy Week? Kind of interesting. But anyway, the first occurrence of this in the Bible is Salem. We also know later on that Abraham did something important there. He returned and he went to the top of Mount Moriah. And there's the arrow, and he sacrificed his son Isaac, or he went to sacrifice his son Isaac as God had commanded him. And when the angel spared him from sacrificing his son, he renamed that place, what we call in most of our Bibles, Jehovah Jireh, Yahweh Jireh. And that name is important. And then after that, the town basically came over to the ownership of the Jebusites. Remember Jacob and his sons, the 70, went to Egypt. They were there for 400 and some years, 430 years. When they came back to the promised land, God told Joshua to conquer all of it. Well, there was one town amongst others that they didn't conquer, they couldn't conquer, and that was the town of Jebus, which the Jebusites controlled. And they, if you remember in the Bible, they're lame and crippled were outside the gates actually saying, our lame and cripple couldn't protect us. You can't take us. And they couldn't. Not until David became king. Remember at the start of David's kingdom, he was king in Hebron for 7.5 years. And only when he united the north and south did he decide to go to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the place God really wanted them to be, where he wanted his temple to be. And he sent, Joab actually volunteered, and he actually climbed a water shaft. And there you can see the arrow pointing to the water shaft where Joab entered. And they took over possession of the city of Jebus. Now, if you kind of combine the two names, Melchizedek called it Salem. When Abraham went to sacrifice his son Isaac on the top of Mount Moriah, he called it Jehovah Jireh. So if you combine Jireh and Salem, you kind of get Jerusalem. Just kind of a play on words, but is that where Jerusalem came from? It is a city of peace, and Salem does mean, translates to shalom, peace. So just kind of interesting. And you can see that the city of David, we'll call it the city of David here, he built this palace at the top end of it. And you can see at the very top the field of Aruna at the top of Mount Moriah. And you can see that it's on a hill, Mount Zion, and it's surrounded by valleys. And if you do a cross section, that kind of looks, the brownish part, of course, is the ground. There's a top of the mount where the city of David resides, and Mount Moriah is just in behind, just to the north of it. And you can see its peak is the top of Mount Moriah is where Jacob went to sacrifice Isaac, and the place he called Jehovah Jireh, and eventually the place where the Ark of the Covenant rested on top. Here's another picture, kind of a representation of Jerusalem after the time of Jesus, before its destruction. So probably around AD 50, AD 60 or so. And you can, again, see the valley, that, the entire, you can see all the hills and the valleys surrounding it. Now, I did find a pretty good map that we're going to use. It was done by a French artist, and he depicted it about the same time, about AD 60, somewhere after the death, somewhere after 44 AD, and before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But Herod the Great was a builder, and he was a great builder. You looked at places he built, like in Masada or Herodium, Caesarea by the Sea, Jerusalem. He was a monumental builder. And if we just zoom in a bit, there you can see encircled here is the original city of David. So pretty small compared to the rest of Jerusalem. Solomon came and he built the original temple on the top of Mount Moriah, and the Ark of the Covenant is inside the Holy of Holies, and it actually resided on the actual stone, the top of Mount Moriah. Of course, we know that that temple was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. But after their captivity of about 70 years, they returned back to the land. Cyrus gave them permission to rebuild the temple. So Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel returned, and they rebuilt the temple in the same location, and we call that Zerubbabel's temple. So that's where the temple started. And then through the Alexandrian conquest, especially when the Seleucids took over control, they actually added to that. And then later on, the Herodians added to it more. And then at the end of that, Herod really expanded on it, and he built the complex. There's about 35 acres in all, so it was pretty big. There's some of the entrances, and we'll look at those a bit later on. Entrances to get to the platform of the temple. Now, are you surprised to see a hippodrome here? And scholars kind of debate this. When we initially visited Israel in 2011, there's a large outdoor complex. It's fairly large, that shows Jerusalem to scale, and they had a hippodrome there. And if you go there today, that hippodrome has kind of been chiseled out. They don't show it. So there's kind of, some scholars believe that there was one. Some scholars say there isn't. So it's kind of a debate. But here, regardless, a lot of people do believe there was a hippodrome, which doesn't really surprise us because Herod was a builder and he was building a Roman city. Remember, Rome was in charge of that whole area, and he was a builder. And just a bit of trivia, if you ever read the book by Lew Wallace called Ben-Hur, I'm sure most of you have seen the movie, but if you read the book, the chariot race in the book was held in the town of Antioch in Syria. That's the same Antioch where the first church, Christian church started, was in Antioch, where Paul ministered in Antioch. So that's where, just a bit of trivia, that's where the race in the novel occurred. You'll also see a theater that Herod had built. There's probably likely a gymnasium and other things that the Romans built in their larger population centers. At the bottom, you see the Pool of Siloam, which was an important part of the city, a lower elevation. There's also a walkway from there that's just been recently uncovered in the past 15, 20 years or so that you can actually walk through now. Showing that main thoroughfare that went from the Pool of Siloam right up into the Temple Mount on Robinson's Arch. Other locations of interest, that's the location of many people believe is the upper room. And if you go to Jerusalem there today, that's where physically the upper room is located, even though that building was built later on by the Crusaders or other people. The original building isn't there anymore, but that's the location. Right next to the tomb of, today it's above the tomb of David. One of the places for the location of the house of the high priest, Caiaphas, is there. And then when Herod initially built Jerusalem, his palace would have been there at the bottom left of that square. The Praetorium was the top right corner of the square. That's where Pontius Pilate would have resided. And then that plaza on the lower right of the square is maybe where the crowds proclaim, "Crucify him, crucify him." And if you remember, Pontius Pilate, his main residence was in Caesarea by the sea, called Caesarea Maritima. That's where he resided most of the time. But he would come to Jerusalem, especially during the festivals, to bring about peace because they were turbulent times and emotions were running pretty high. Herod Antipas, in the same way, he was reigning over Galilee, and his city, his main residence was in Tiberias by the Sea of Galilee, but he would also come to Jerusalem, and that was his palace right there. And we'll look at this place a bit more in detail later on, but that's the place of where Jesus was crucified. And again, we'll talk about that later on in our study. And the last point to highlight here is the Antonia Fortress. And Herod built that, and he named it after one of his very close friends, Mark Antony. And you've heard of him likely when you hear of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Well, that was Mark Antony, and Herod named it after his very good friend. So we call it the Antonia Fortress. And here's another overlay of the city of Jerusalem, kind of giving you just a schematic reference. But again, if we pause that a bit, you can see the main highlights. Near the middle, you can see the oval where the hippodrome was. Down the bottom left, you can see the upper room, the high priest's house, Caiaphas, Herod's fortress, and the residence, the praetorium, where Pontius Pilate was, Golgotha, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. So you can see some of the same details. Now, when we looked at Palm Sunday, Jesus came down from the Mount of Olives, and that's what you see circled in that red box. And we talked of the route that he took, and I believe that's the route he took on Palm Sunday because he was riding a donkey. He entered Jerusalem, and to enter Jerusalem, you have to go through the city gates, which is at the top right of the square. That's the walls of Jerusalem. Rode through Jerusalem, and then he entered the temple complex through the sheep gate, which is likely the same gate that the high priest would have be coming through with the Passover lamb when he was coming in from Bethlehem on Palm Sunday. So Jesus would have likely entered the sheep gate through that route. But the rest of the week, Jesus probably took this shorter route that led directly into the temple. It didn't enter Jerusalem. It led directly into the temple through the Golden Gate or the Shushan Gate, the Eastern Gate, directly into the temple. And what we'll be looking at today, the cleansing of the temple, occurred in this area, in the royal porch or the royal stoa, as we would call it, and the Gentiles' court. So today we'll be looking at Jesus cleansing the temple. And here's another artist representation, and it just shows you the magnificence of what Herod's temple would have looked like at the time of Jesus. This is from let me get my directions, a northeast viewpoint. You can see the low wall surrounding the temple. That wall was known as the Soreg, and it was a wall that prevented Gentiles from going any further. The wall was a latticed wall. It was only about 3.5, 4 feet tall, but there were signs basically preventing Gentiles from going in under punishment of death. So, there was warnings there. Inside, only Jews were allowed. And you can see the temple, proper temple itself with the court of the woman, the four tall lampstands, and then going through the gates into the court of the Israelites where the actual temple resided. Off to the top left, you can see the royal stoa or the royal porch where the events of today occur. And then if you look in the very background of the image at the top right, that's likely showing Herod's palace and the praetorium. And here's another view, schematic representation of it. And we'll do a bit of review of what we looked at Palm Sunday a bit more in detail. And at the bottom, and this is the south entrance, one of the main entrances, and you can see some shops that were built along that southern wall, and with a raised walkway over top of it. And also, we talked of this, the ritual bath or mikvahs, where pilgrims, travelers would be able to go in there and ritually purify themselves before entering the temple complex. And they would enter the temple complex through the triple gate, the Hulda gate, and it was kind of a one-way, just like we have our one-way streets. Well, this was a one-way entrance where they would actually climb stairs beneath the royal stoa and enter on top of the platform. And if they wanted to leave, then they would leave through those gates there, down the stairways, into the double gate, and exit that way. And the main reason was just to control the crowds, because the population of Jerusalem increased by about 5 times during these times. And there's Robinson's Arch that we looked at, which was a large, it was actually another engineering feat by Herod. And people would enter that, and it actually allowed the walkways on the western wall, because there were shops there also. So it allowed that to be open to public, and it allowed people to actually enter the temple complex right into the royal stoa, the royal porch. Other entrances, Wilson's Arch, which came through town and it entered onto the temple platform there. The western wall is all along there, and that part is where the Wailing Wall today, you see pictures of it, that would be the location of the Wailing Wall, which is really part of the western wall, which was a reinforcement. I'll show you a picture of that later on. It wasn't part of the temple proper, but it was a reinforcing wall, support wall for the temple complex. And Passover Sunday, we talked of Jesus entering the sheep gate, which was on the northern wall, and that is the pool of Israel, where they would wash the sacrificial animals before they were sacrificed, likely. And that was likely a holding area. Josephus records about 256,000 lambs being slain during Passover week. So you had to put them somewhere, not in Jerusalem, because remember, the streets were very narrow. And here's the Eastern gate. And one of the reasons I think Jesus on Palm Sunday didn't enter that gate was, if you look at it, you know, it's very narrow stairs, it's steep. A donkey would have been very hard to navigate going up those stairs. It says that he entered Jerusalem. Well, you really don't enter Jerusalem through that gate. You enter the temple complex. And more specifically, you enter the temple proper. So donkey, being unclean, would not have been able to enter that, and the crowds of people wouldn't have been there to welcome him. It's only when he was going through, entering Jerusalem through Jerusalem, and that's at the northern part. So anyway, you know, just reinforce that. And we'll get back to the topic of our study today, is looking at this. And this is the royal stoa, or the royal porch, quite a building accomplishment by Herod. Its length was about the length of 3 football fields, about 912 feet long. So pretty spectacular. And here we reference the court of the Gentiles. There's part of the court of the Gentiles there. Now, when we talk of Jesus teaching in the temple, whenever he went to Jerusalem and taught, you know, at the feasts, the Bible mentions different locations. One of the most popular traditions for rabbinical teachers to teach is from this area here. There were steps, and this is in Jewish tradition. People, rabbis, teachers, scribes would teach from that area. So no doubt Jesus taught. When we looked at Jesus being 12 years old, many people believe that that's where he taught from. And in the Bible, when he taught, he likely taught there. And you can see that the Jews would have been able to see and hear, but also the Gentiles, because the court of the Gentiles was just where that little low wall is, so they would have been able to see and hear Jesus teach. Other locations, right there in that complex by the royal porch, because it was covered, there were colonnades there, was covered, Jesus would teach there. He also taught in the court of the woman, which was open to everywhere, well, open to the Jews, but again, very popular place for people to gather in the temple. And if you heard of Solomon's porch, he taught from there. That's on the eastern location to the right, and to the left were the colonnades where he likely taught from there too. So Jesus, when he taught from the temple, he reached all peoples. He spoke to everybody, and it's recorded that he taught in all those locations. So we're going to go to a little video that I saw, and it's quite an interesting video. It's Hebrew, so it's a voiceover. So don't be don't be wondering if the voices don't match the mouth. But anyway, it was done in Hebrew.
Around the Temple Mount Plaza, porticos of magnificent columns were built, the stoas. The most magnificent of all was the Royal Stoa. The Royal Stoa was where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is today, behind me. Known as Stoa Basilia, this was the largest building in Israel until the modern era. In Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus Flavius describes the building as a forest of columns. It contained 162 columns, each made of a single stone. It would take 3 men with outstretched arms to encircle one column. This structure, which was a sort of basilica, was used for secular purposes. It is the location of the shops where the Sanhedrin met after being exiled from the Hall of Hewn Stones adjacent to the temple. To allow entrance to the Royal Stoa, a monumental staircase was built that rose up from a vibrant shopping center here at the foot of the western wall. A huge arch, Robinson's Arch, supported an elevated passage that crossed the busy street without disrupting traffic. The main entrance to the Temple Mount were the Hulda gates in the southern wall. 2 gates were planned, an entrance and an exit. This ensured that the huge crowds would flow in and out quickly and efficiently. The great width of the steps leading to the gates created an atmosphere of splendor and reverence. The stairs were designed with treads of varying sizes, forcing the pilgrims into a relaxed, dignified pace as they ascended to the holy place. When they emerged at the Temple Mount Plaza, the pilgrims saw an astonishing sight. The huge plaza, the Stoa, the courts, the ornate gates. At the top of the hill, towering to the heavens, rose the temple building itself.
So it kind of gives you a nice video representation of what it actually would have looked like at the time of Jesus. Spectacular. So let's get back into our study in the Gospel of Luke.
Then he went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in it.
So he went into the temple and drove out, notice, all those who bought and sold in it. So kind of interesting comment, and we'll just let that soak a bit. Mark adds a bit more to it. So not only did he drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. So he was doing quite a bit of turning things upside down. Mark also records that he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. And when you look at the temple and the proper word used for temple in the writings here, when you look at the Greek, it actually means the temple complex, not the proper temple where the Jews were only allowed to be, but the whole complex, the 35 acres of it. And when Mark said he wouldn't allow anyone to carry wares through the temple, what people were doing is when you entered Jerusalem, if you came from the south, west, if you came from the west, if you came from the northwest, if you came from the north, you were able to actually enter Jerusalem proper. But if you came from places, especially from the northeast and the east, from Damascus or from Jericho, from the Mount of Olives, from Bethany, you didn't enter Jerusalem proper. You can take the shortcut and enter Jerusalem just like Jesus did, enter the temple. You would enter the temple directly. So people were using the temple as a shortcut. They would go up those narrow stairs that we saw at the eastern gate, walk through the temple as a shortcut to get into Jerusalem. So, we've all taken shortcuts in our lives. Well, these people were taking shortcuts, and somehow the priests were allowing it. So Jesus put an end to that, and he stopped people from using that as a shortcut. So the next question now is, why were money changers and merchants on the Temple Mount? Which is an interesting question. And there's several reasons for it. So remember, the Jews, all Jews, attended festivals 3 times a year. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was the 7-day holiday, which included Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of First Fruits. So they would go there once a year. And at that time, they were to pay the temple tax. So once a year, they paid the temple tax. The other feast they had to attend was the Feast of Pentecost. And we read of that in Acts 2 when Peter spoke to the crowds. They were from all over the world. Well, that was Jews basically attending Jerusalem on that feast. And the last feast was in the fall, Shavuot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And again, people attended that. So 3 times a year. If you remember looking at the map, and we'll look at one a bit later, the city of Jerusalem basically held about, roughly 50, 60,000 people. But during festivals, that would increase by 5 times. So it's a significant population. And remember, they didn't have Uber or rapid transit or airlines back then. They had to walk. So if you were walking from hundreds of miles away or 50 miles away, whatever the distance, when you had to sacrifice the animals, well, you wouldn't bring your sacrificial animals with you. It was a lot easier for you to travel, to make the journey to Jerusalem as light as possible, because you're traveling essentially by feet or by donkey or whatever method. And when you arrived at the temple, when it was time to sacrifice, you would purchase your animal there. So purchasing sacrificial animals was convenient for the pilgrims. It was a good thing to have that. And same with the temple tax. To pay the temple tax, it had to be in a certain currency, the half shekel. So that, again, that was a service provided, which was good for people coming in because now they were able to pay it in the proper currency. So it was important to have money changers, and it was important to have merchants for the pilgrims. It was a good thing to have. So that's why they were there, and their place was mostly in the royal store or the royal porch, because it was a big area, and people were able to do their selling and buying from there. It was away from the temple. Now, just a bit of interesting things. So it was convenient for pilgrims, but also the money changers weren't I was going to try to say, they're kind of notorious for kind of adding a little bit more interest to the actual exchange of money. So they were charging more for what the money was actually worth. And the same with people doing the sacrifices, the sacrificial animals. People were buying it, but they were paying an exorbitant fee to purchase those sacrificial animals. And on top of that, the local people who could bring their own lambs to sacrifice, a lot of times because these merchants weren't the best, they would actually say, "Oh, I don't know. I don't think that meets the requirements of having a spot or blemish. That has a blemish, so we can't use that. You have to buy from us." And the real winners in terms of the profits were really the Sadducees, specifically the high priest. They would take a cut of all the profits made. So it was a big place to make money, for as much as it is from the Sadducees, specifically the high priest, because they would pocket some of the profits. And to make matters worse, and I was shocked at this, and you might be shocked of it, that was the official half shekel. It was called the Tyrian shekel. That was the official shekel that the high priest would accept for temple tax, and only that coin. The same coin that Judas, when he received the 30 silver coins, that coin. And you'll notice the image. On the one side was it's not an image of a man, it's the image of a god. It was a god of Tyre, Heracles Melkart. And on the other side was an image of an eagle on a ship's ram. The Bible specifically prohibited making graven images. It was against the law. It was against what the Bible allowed, and yet the high priests, the Sadducees, only wanted that coin, and the main reason was it was the highest, purest silver content of any coin. So the priests were more interested in the silver and the quality of it, and they actually made rules to go around it, saying that because it was being offered to God as a temple tax, you can ignore the graven images because it was more important to go to what it was meant to be. So kind of inside, but you can look at it. But the silver content was really good on these coins. So if we get back to our gospel, he went into the temple, he drove those who bought and sold in it, and he said to them,
"It is written, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves."
So here Jesus quotes the prophets again, Jesus fulfilling scripture. He's quoting from Isaiah 56:7, where he says it's a house of prayer, and a den of thieves was quoted in Jeremiah 7, verse 11. So Jesus quotes that, and we talked about the silver that the priests, specifically the Sadducees and the high priest, they should have been praying. A quote, I believe it was Warren Wiersbe said this. He said, instead of praying for the people, the priests, specifically the Sadducees, were preying on the people. So kind of an interesting quote, but it shows you where the heart was. Jesus' heart, Jesus had a spiritual view of religion where the Jews primarily looked upon the temple as a place of sacrifice. Jesus, in his 3 years of teaching, was basically teaching the heart of the law, the spiritual aspects of it, where the Jews themselves had taken God's 613 commandments and turned them into thousands and thousands and thousands of rules and regulations, and around the temple was specific to sacrifice. So kind of an interesting sidebar. So Jesus comes in, he overturns money changers' tables, chases them out. So the real question now is, why did Jesus cleanse the temple? Why did he cleanse the temple? We know that the high priest was kind of pocketing a lot of profits, so that really wasn't a good thing. Jesus had attended several times before. In his first year of ministry, he did do it once, but he didn't do it. It's not recorded. He did it in the second year or third year. So why did he cleanse the temple? Well, yeah, the greed was obviously one reason. So, they were stealing from pilgrims wanting to do the right thing. They were stealing and pocketing money themselves. The high priest was pocketing money. So that was one of the reasons. But the second reason, and the one we want to look at, is the sellers, the money changers, should have really been doing their trading, their selling from the royal colonnade or the royal stoa, that covered building. But it got so big that it creeped into the court of the Gentiles. So it was actually taken, it was so popular and there were so many people that it actually went into the court of the Gentiles, likely, and it disrupted Jesus' ability to be able to teach people coming to hear him. He wanted to teach everybody. But there's so much commerce going on, specifically in the court of Gentiles, with all the noise in that it prevented that. So let's look at a bit at the scripture when he quotes from Isaiah 56, and we see that in Mark 11, verse 11. Mark records that Jesus says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." And if we go back to Genesis, specifically Genesis 12:3, God said that I will bless those who bless you, I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So all the families of the earth, all nations. And back to Isaiah 56:7, at the bottom of that quote, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. And there's kind of the picture. And the royal stoa is where the merchants should have been. But I believe they crept into the court of the Gentiles, which should have been a house of prayer for all peoples. Now, when you look at the specific Hebrew word, I know you can read Hebrew, that's the red word at the bottom left, but the proper Hebrew word means peoples, nations. The Greek is ethne, and I know for those at church, Pastor Steve uses that a lot in his teaching, ethnic, borders, which really means peoples, nations. However, when it's translated to English, the English word used is Gentiles. So here they call it the court of the Gentiles, but if you applied the proper translation from the Hebrew and from the Greek, it should really be called the court of all nations. So that's why Mark calls it here, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? And just a bit of history again. When we look at the temple, when Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel returned, they rebuilt the temple. We call it Zerubbabel's temple, on the same location as Solomon's temple. And then when Alexander invaded and the Seleucids took control of Jerusalem, they did some expansion on that. They added gates and walls and other things. And then after the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC or so, they expanded. The Herodian dynasty took over and they added expansion. So they actually expanded on the platform. And as we saw, when Herod came about, he really expanded and added 35 acres. So the yellow portion really became, in a way, the court of the Gentiles or the court of the nations. And the rest of it, the green, was, where the traders and that should have been, especially in the royal stoa. And here's another picture, just to kind of show you the structure, the support walls that Herod would have built and others to support that whole complex. And the western wall, of course, as we talked about before, was really a support wall. It wasn't part of the proper temple, but it supported that platform. So anyway, back to our original schematic, there was a proper temple complex for the Jews only in red, and the court of the Gentiles, or the court of all nations, if we want to use that term, in blue. So again, when we get back to our question, why did Jesus cleanse the temple? It was because God had really meant for the temple to be used for all nations. The millennial temple, all nations go there. So God's original intent was for all people to hear the good news. So when Jesus taught, he wanted everyone to hear it. Actually, in the Gospel of John, it records that Gentiles came on that Monday and wanted to talk to Jesus because they were hearing him. So what really happened was that the Jewish nation, because of all their rules and regulations and wanting money, they basically acted as a stumbling block for Gentiles who wanted to come to God during their large celebrations and hear and see what was going on. So they were actually preventing Gentiles, and they were keeping them in darkness because that's where Jesus was teaching. So the Gentiles, people from all nations, could not hear Jesus teach. So really, I believe that was the reason why he cleansed the temple, was to clear that area. And we know that the rest of the week, Jesus taught in the temple. So he did teach. People did come to hear, as we talked about the Greeks wanting to hear him. So that was the one reason. Another question, was Jesus angry when he cleansed the temple? Well, there is righteous anger, and we know Jesus didn't sin. We know Paul later on says, be angry and sin not. So there was righteous anger, but is it the same kind of anger that uh, we have, especially when someone insults us, or someone, for example, talking to men, someone cuts you off in traffic, you immediately react and you get anger right away. Well, Jesus didn't have that kind of anger. It was righteous anger, and it was timed. We know on Palm Sunday, and this is going back to Mark chapter 11, we know on Palm Sunday that when he entered Jerusalem, that when he went into the temple, he looked around at all things and left. Well, that selling and trading would have been occurring then too. So Jesus was actually in the temple. He looked at it. He saw it. He heard it. He looked at all things. He didn't do anything. If you had an anger that, when we get angry when someone, slaps us in the face or throws water on us or insults us or cuts us in traffic or cuts us in front of a line, we react right away. We know Jesus didn't react right there physically. So the anger that Jesus had was really a righteous anger. We hear in the word that he had a zeal for God's house. He wanted to do the right thing. So it was kind of a righteous anger, and he was motivated for right reasons. It was controlled. It was the right duration, because we know that Jesus went on and taught. We know he didn't teach in anger. And he had the proper result in that the Temple Mount was cleared for Jesus to be able to teach.
And he was teaching daily in the temple.
So he was teaching daily in the temple. So really, in terms of, did something come out of it? No. He taught not only that the rest of that Monday, but he came back through the week teaching. But notice here.
But the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him, and were unable to do anything, for all the people were very attentive to hear him.
So the people were very attentive. Jesus overturning tables and upsetting the cart. The scribes, the leaders, the Sadducees, the high priests would have been just fuming. Hey, that's my money. That's my income. Like, what are you doing? You're going to cause a riot. You're going to cause the Romans to come in. They were probably wanting to do something. They actually wanted to kill him. Is what they wanted to do. They wanted to destroy him, but they couldn't do anything because the people were attentive. They wanted to hear Jesus. Mark says that they were astonished to hear him. So even though the leaders wanted to destroy Jesus, wanted to kill him, wanted to get on with the way, they couldn't do it because they feared the crowds and they didn't want the Romans to come in and upset the celebrations or cause a riot. So just kind of interesting. So on day 2, on Monday, when evening had come, so all day Jesus started the day by overturning the tables, preventing people from going through and abusing the court of the Gentiles, the court of nations, and he taught all day. So in the evening, he went out of the city and likely went back to Bethany. And this is for those of you present during Bible study. I am recording these, so I'm posting them on my own YouTube, but eventually they will be placed on the church YouTube page. This is kind of, we're getting to go that place, but for now they're here on mine, and you can see the various presentations there. And to end things, Chuck Missler, he quotes this and says this a lot. Don't believe everything I say. Go and do your homework. Be like a Berean in Acts 17. Remember, Paul was teaching. He was preaching. What better teacher? And yet, they went and studied scriptures themselves to make sure, daily, to make sure that those things were so. So, the information is here. You can rewind. You can go back and check it. But check it for yourself. Make up your own mind to see what's there. And then when we get to our next study, continue reading into Luke, and here we'll see day 3, and a lot of things happen on day 3. His authority is questioned. He has some parables, and we'll see separate encounters with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and that'll be part one of perhaps another one, because at the end of the day, he has the Olivet Discourse, which will be on another day. So thank you for joining us, and we'll end the Bible study here. And Lord willing, we'll see you next week. Blessings to all.